I want to tie in Seán Mac Diarmada with some of the major politics of the time, but I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of Home Rule and actually the ins and outs of the Rising and all the rest of it. I want to tie him into what he did, because Seán Mac Diarmada was the organising genius behind the Rising. And that's what he spent his whole life doing, from the time he was 23 until he was executed. He kept very much in the background. He wrote no memoirs, no diaries. We have letters that he sent to people, but no letters that people sent to him. He and Tom Clarke, who were very close together from 1908, were obsessed with secrecy. So much so that when it came to weeks before the Rising, hardly anybody knew any of the details of the Rising because he'd kept it to himself. But I want to try to show you as well, if the Rising had happened, it would have been the biggest Rising since 1798. You're talking about tens of thousands of people right across the island. And I want to show you as quickly as I can when it comes to that point. There was a national plan. So yeah, the idea that 200 or 300 people got themselves into the GPO and got themselves killed is for the birds. This was something that was going to be an all-island Rising, carefully planned. So let me talk about the beginnings of Mac Diarmada, because he was John McDermott to start with. He was born in 1883 outside Kilty Clocher, a place called Glenfarne. It's the back of beyond. It still is the back of beyond. If you can go to the farm that he was born in, it's still there. It's a national monument, and it's up a bad road and then up a path off a bad road, and it's very, very small area. It becomes bogland quite quickly. He was the 8th of 10 children. His father was a carpenter and really part-time farmer. Now, he wanted to be a teacher, and from 1897 to 1904, he was what they called a monitor, where you leave school at 14 and that was it. But if you're going to be a teacher, you stay on and you help the teacher for about 6 or 7 years, and then do an exam called the King's Scholarship, which was an exceptionally difficult exam. Not so much but sort of intellectually difficult. You had to learn a lot, you had to remember a lot, but there was a whole range of subjects which you had to pass all at the same time, and he didn't make it. He said himself when he was a kid that he said, Euclid, I hate Euclid, and if he catches me in the exam, he'll do for me. And he did. This is what you had to do in order to pass the King's Scholarship and go to the training college in Drumcondra. And you had to pass English. These were called failing subjects. There were other subjects you had to do, but it didn't matter if you failed them. But you had to pass all these at the same time. English, arithmetic, music, drawing, and penmanship. So you had to be a perfect writer to be a teacher. It doesn't happen nowadays. So he didn't make it. And in 1904, he couldn't really have made it. I mean, there was no library in Kilty Clocher. There was nothing to go on. So he left. And then sort of wondered what he was going to do for a while. But during this period, he got interested in Irish history, Irish politics. And I should say that his family, his mother and father spoke Irish to each other in the house. And he spoke Irish, but not well. And he was illiterate in Irish. And I know that his mother and father spoke Irish because I interviewed Mac Diarmada's grandnephew, who used to live up at Hannistown. And he knew his different relations. He went to a place called Tullynamoyle in Cavan to learn how to read and write Irish. He could speak it, but he couldn't read it. And it was the old kind of Irish, where there's no H's. It was, dots. He became interested in Irish history, Irish songs. His party piece was Emmett's speech from the dock, which he used to do from 1905 on. Having done that, he moved to Belfast. And he tried Scotland for a while, didn't work, came back, moved to Belfast in 1905, became a tram conductor in November. And he was getting about 3D an hour for a 10-hour day. And he was sacked in July 1906 for smoking on the platform. Now, I think he wasn't just sacked because he was smoking on the platform. I think he was sacked because he was already on special branch files by July 1906. And the reason he was on special branch files was he had been making speeches. His first speech was in Clarke Street with Bulmer Hobson and Dennis McCullough, who was the head of the IRB in Belfast. And if you want to get noticed by special branch, you make a speech with Bulmer Hobson and Dennis McCullough. And they were chased, actually, in Clarke Street by the crowd, not by the police. But he was good at public speaking. But it's during this time that he was a tram conductor that he got interested in republicanism and the IRB. And he got interested because he was lodging in Butler Street on Ardoyne with a Protestant Republican called Frank Wilson, much to his amazement, because this was a strange species, because there weren't many of them in Kilty Clogher. And probably Frank Wilson was the first one he'd ever met. And Wilson introduced him to Dennis McCullough and Bulmer Hobson. And very quickly he was sworn into the IRB. Bulmer Hobson persuaded him that you could still be a Catholic and be sworn into the IRB. McDermott was a bit sort of worried about that because it was secret oaths, and so it was condemned by the church. Anyway, he got sworn in. And he was living in Ardoyne because it was near the tram depot, the Ardoyne shops, which is where the tram depot used to be. So he and Hobson and McCullough were exactly the same age. The three of them were born in January 1883. And through 1907, they set up a group called the Dungannon Clubs. The Dungannon Clubs were based on the 1780s Dungannon Clubs to have an Irish Parliament. And they spread themselves across the north and into Scotland. And very quickly, because McDermott had no job, they made him the organiser of the Dungannon Clubs throughout, anywhere you could go. So there were about 30 or 40 guys in Belfast, and they each put in a shilling a week. And that was his wage. So it was 30 shillings a week. And they gave him a bicycle, and off he went to try to get people in to the Dungannon Clubs. He began to call himself Seán Mac Diarmada in 1907. He kept running into real difficulties with Hibernians who thought he was a traitor because he had been a Hibernian before he came to Belfast. He got into fights, mainly in Tyrone. The Tyrone ones were the biggest problem. The big change comes when, in 1907, the sort of political development. So I'm going to try to move quickly through that. 1906 general election, the Liberal Party got a huge majority. and changed the scene in British politics. They didn't need the Irish Party anymore. Until that point, the Liberal Party always depended on the Irish Party, and they were committed to Home Rule. After 1906, they weren't. They were quite clear they were going to have nothing to do with Home Rule, and they didn't need any support. They had such a big majority. This annoyed so many people in the Irish Party. And one of them, a guy called Dolan, Charles Dolan, who was the MP for Leitrim North, resigned from the Irish Party and joined Sinn Féin and said he was going to resign from Parliament and fight a by-election as a Sinn Féin candidate, which suddenly threw everything up in the air, because Sinn Féin weren't fighting elections, they were fighting council elections from 1905. They weren't fighting Westminster elections, and the question was, would they bother even fighting Westminster elections? Well, they didn't have an organisation, they didn't have an electoral party, and suddenly they had to do this, because here's an opportunity, this guy's standing as a Sinn Féin candidate. So they sent Mac Diarmada to Leitrim North to organise the by-election. And it was his breakthrough. He's a brilliant organiser. And from nothing, in the summer of 1907, when the by-election was called, it was February 1908, and Mac Diarmada spent the whole time organising, recruiting people, trying to get something pulled together with, and this is one of the key things, money from Clan na Gael, and trying to swear people into the IRB and trying to help them. And John Devoy in America sent £100 to help the election. Now, you might think, big deal, £100 to help the by-election. This is 1907. In modern purchasing power, that's £15,600 to fight the election. Mac Diarmada set up a newspaper. Arthur Griffith wrote for the newspaper. They handed the newspaper out free all around the place. It was a really ferocious by-election. Lots of fighting, lots of difficulties, lots of trouble. They brought Anna Parnell, Parnell's sister, and Charles Gavin Duffy to try to impress the crowds. They wouldn't let Anna Parnell speak. They locked her in a hotel. On her third attempt, she got out and got up on top of a box. They threw a bucket of water over her. They hit Charles Gavin Duffy over the head with a shillelagh. And luckily he was wearing a hard hat. He wrecked his hat, but his head was okay. They attacked Seán Mac Diarmada, a guy called Dermot Lynch, very senior IRB guy. There's a fight outside a hotel. But he did well. There was no chance of him winning from the word go, because the Irish Party was so well organised, the Catholic Church was on its side. Some of the stuff the Catholic Church put out in the by-election was unbelievable. Bulmer Hobson, they said, was an Orange man who'd been sent down from Belfast to convert the Catholics and ruin Catholic education. Technically, a Quaker isn't even a Protestant, but it doesn't matter. It was a really dirty by-election, but it made his name as an organiser. And then he moved to Dublin and went into digs with Bulmer Hobson and Pat McCartan from Carrickmore. When the election was over, the Americans had sent the equivalent of £109,000 to fight the election in modern money. So there's no shortage of cash. By 1908, Mac Diarmada is appointed Sinn Féin's full-time organiser, but also the IRB's full-time organiser. Well, how does he get to be that? He gets to be that because Clan Gael, John Devoy, had sent Tom Clarke back to Ireland to reorganise the IRB, which he started to do from January 1908. He had been in America since 1899 after serving 15 years in really dreadful conditions in English jails. When he was released, he went to America. Clan Gael gave him a 60-acre farm. There's a monument on his farm, actually, outside New York. He came back to Ireland. Clan Gael bought him a newsagent tobacconist shop. He rented another one. He bought a house. It's American money. And he hit it off immediately with Seán Mac Diarmada. One of the reasons, perhaps, was that Mac Diarmada's father had been a Fenian, and he knew a guy called John Daly who'd been in jail with Tom Clarke. And John Daly had later become a successful businessman and the mayor of Limerick. So immediately they hit it off together. And from that time until he was executed, Mac Diarmada followed everywhere by the police. That's the only way we know what he was doing as an organiser. It's the special branch reports, or in the south, the G-men reports from Dublin. And he's all over the place. I'll give you an example of the sort of coverage that he had. This is very early days, 1909. Police record that he was in Scotland in January, and then Belfast, then on to Limerick, Galway. By March, he was in Cork, Tipperary in April, Cork again, Kerry in May, and so on for years, recruiting people, joining various organisations, finding out who people were, and swearing people into the IRB, which technically he wasn't supposed to be doing, because there used to be all this formal thing about being proposed and accepted by a circle. But Mac Diarmada just went straight. And of course, he was speaking for Tom Clarke, who was this sort of legendary figure, which the British, amazingly, as one of the big own goals, where they released him in 1898 on the anniversary of 1798, because they thought that would please his Irish supporters. It certainly did, but not in the way they imagined it was going to. So from then on, that's what he did. Now, there's from 1909 right through to 1913. It's an uphill journey, an uphill struggle, because there's nothing happening. The IRB were practically on their backs. They were mostly over 50, and they were very, very small numbers. And as you got to 1910, 1911, another big political change, and suddenly Home Rule looks as if it's going to be passed. So nobody wanted to be bothered with Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin had trouble getting an Ardèche, filling a room in 1912 with enough people to have an Ardèche, because everybody was going for Home Rule, including Pearse, in fact, who made speeches in favour of it. And then you all know what happened. It didn't happen. And they went straight from the Irish Party straight across to Sinn Féin and Republicans. And the volunteers were established in opposition to the Ulster Volunteers in 1913. And Mac Diarmada was one of the main speakers at the Mansion House in November 1913 at the foundation of the Volunteers. Now, he had organised the IRB so thoroughly over those years and built them up and got rid of all the old guys who used to sit around and talk about what happened in the 1870s, that when the Volunteers were founded, what Mac Diarmada and Hobson and Clarke and a couple of others, what they did was make sure the officers and the volunteers were, as far as possible, were IRB men. And that the volunteers were really unknown to themselves, a front for the IRB. And the best crew they had was Owen McNeill, who was Chief of Staff of the volunteers. Now, Owen McNeill was a self-important ditherer, very academic, wore a pince-nez, very important person. And he loved being Chief of Staff of the volunteers. He hadn't a clue. They were simply using him as the front man because he was respectable. And because he'd such a reputation, I mean, he was heavily involved in getting the Irish language accepted as an official language. You could use Irish now. But he was their ideal front man, though he didn't know it. Now, during those years from 1909 to 1913, where nothing apparently is happening, in fact, quite a lot was happening, and the IRB was reorganised mainly by Seán Mac Diarmada, to a lesser extent by Bulmer Hobson, particularly in the Dublin area. And they built up presence in Conor and Gaeilge. McDermott played Hurley in Phoenix Park with the Keating branch. They got involved in Irish-speaking drama. McDermott had made his own Hurley, which is a brutal-looking thing. It's in the National Museum. It's allegedly used for playing Hurley. Now, in the middle of all this, McDermott's life changed. In August 1911, because he's travelling around all the time and because he's dealing with drinking contaminated water as the most likely cause, he got polio. And very unusually for an adult, he got polio and his right leg was paralysed and had various other problems. So he was out for 4 months. He was in hospital from August 1911 right through to January 1912. And when he got out, people couldn't recognise him. He had failed so much. People said he decided that he wasn't going to live long. He used to say, "I don't think I will ever make old bones." And he would do as much as he could while he was still alive. He would just throw himself into what he thought were his remaining years. And that's what he did from 1912 right the way through, on and on, never stopped. Now, in those years after the volunteers were formed, very quickly from 1914 on, the leaders, Clarke and McDermott, were determined to have a rising. And they began planning for that rising and trying to get guns from Germany. They sent people to Germany, Joseph Plunkett, and McDermott was going to send his girlfriend to Germany, a woman called Min Ryan. He called her Maureen. She's one of 12 children from a very well-to-do family in Wexford. And she could speak German. She'd learned German at UCD, where she had been sent. Half her family went to university. Very unusual. From this period on, with the gun running and which Tom Clarke and McDermott organised incoming in Dublin. They went by taxi because they couldn't march. But McDermott organised something like 1,200 members of the volunteers of the Féine, and had 1,200 oak battens made, because they thought there were just over 30 inches long, each batten. And they thought that would be a match for the RIC. They didn't expect the British Army to be involved in trying to take the weapons off them. However, it was McDermott who organised the battens being made by a guy called Sean Tobin in a garage, just off what is now Pierce Street. And they also brought in guns through Kilcoole in Wexford. The guns were rubbish, actually. There's one at the back, a German Mauser. They were used in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, single shots. And they fired, you needed black powder. So every time you fired a shot, there was this sort of miasma of black powder and you got covered in it. But they were still rifles. In the meantime, they're organising the rising. And as I sort of said at the outset, I wasn't going to go into the details of the rising and all that was about it. I just wanted to concentrate on the fact that there was a national plan. Which McDiarmada and Joseph Plunkett pulled together. Now, to give you an idea of the extent of the national plan, well, first of all, some evidence that there was. There's a guy called O'Hannigan who was the commandant of the volunteers in the Louth area and later became a member of GHQ staff in the IRA in 1920-21. O'Hannigan says, I had seen the plans for the rising on 2 or 3 occasions, and Liam Mellows and I went over them in detail. They were drawn up by Thomas MacDonagh, Joseph Plunkett, and Seán Mac Diarmada. And again, he says, on another occasion, that he had seen where they were kept in the case of the country, it was expected they would rise, and a general instruction to them was that they were to attack and capture British garrisons. One of the big plans was to capture British garrison near Athlone, where German prisoners of war were kept in 1915. And the reason they wanted to get these German prisoners of war was some of them were artillerymen, and they could use artillery pieces that were going to be captured by the British. So the general plan was that they were to attack and capture the British garrisons in their area. Thomas McCurtown and McSweeney had worked out a plan to cover Munster, including the landing of arms. The plan was kept by Seán Mac Diarmada in his safe in Dawson Street. I remember the special mission of the Galtee Battalion was to capture Fermoy and the Kilworth camps. So it's not just this crowd of guys in the GPO. This is an absolutely enormous rising that was planned. Give you another example is a guy called Alex McCabe that McDiarmada had appointed to be in charge of the IRB along the west coast, northwest coast. And his instructions were, in the event of the rising, he was to destroy communications, blow up telegraph poles, and bridges, and prevent reinforcements coming across the Shannon. So in August 1915, Alex McCabe went into Gilmore's hardware shop in Sligo and bought £25 of gelignite, as you do. You know, you could do that. You know, can you just imagine? You win £25 of gelignite. Okay, here you are. Would you like a detonator? You know, he got arrested at the station because he was going to take the gelignite elsewhere. He was arrested and taken to Dublin because they thought if he was tried, he might be acquitted by a Sligo jury. So they brought him to Dublin to be tried, and he was acquitted in Dublin. McCabe said afterwards he thinks he was the last man tried in front of a jury for having weapons and explosives. So that's his job. And McDiarmada told him to take a teaching job in Killybegs that became available. because Killybegs might be used as a harbour to distribute some of the German weapons. In the meantime, McDermott had been arrested in Tuam. He did a lot of work in Galway, Kerry and Cork, looking for suitable harbours and trying to organise what would happen when the German weapons came in. He was arrested in Tuam. He was in the back of a cart with Liam Mellows and 2 special branch in the audience. And as soon as he said in the middle of his speech, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, they got up and arrested him. He's arrested under what's called the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA. Literally, you could be arrested for anything under DORA. But they were arresting loads of people in 1915, mainly because of the new Attorney General in London who gave instructions to implement DORA much more strictly. And the new Attorney General was a person called Edward Carson, who seemed to know something about Ireland. So he got 4 months hard labour from August 1915, which is really difficult for him, splitting logs, because effectively he only had the one leg. However, he had made friends in jail very quickly with the crew of a German ship who were interned in jail. And the captain of the German ship, he sent guys to find easy logs for McDermott, and the other guys brought over ones they'd split and just threw them in a pile. But once he got out, then preparations for the rising began in detail. And you all know what happened. The guns were coming from Germany in the odd, didn't arrive in the way that they wanted, didn't arrive at the time that they wanted. But again, just to give you an idea of the organisation, McDermott and the people around him realised if there's going to be 20,000 rifles coming in, they knew how many men it took at Howth and Kilcool to bring and carry the rifles. And only a few hundred rifles, but if there's 20,000, they're going to need a hell of a lot of men to shift them, and there were explosives and various other pieces of equipment. So McDermott ordered Michael Staines to hire a marquee so that people could stay in it and take the weapons out of the ship and put them on trains. They were going to have commandeer the train from Cork, and they had 3 lorries organised. Michael Staines was a guy who raised the tricolour over the GPO, and he later became Garda Commissioner. So there he was, trying to organise navigation lights, radios, all the rest of it. To shift these, you think about shifting 20,000 rifles, you know, it's going to be a huge number. In order to do that, guys from the Kerry volunteers were marched overnight to get there in time to get to Feeney for the stuff coming in. Now, it was never going to happen. It wasn't just a matter of accident and wrong time and the fact that the Germans, the odd, had no radio anyway. They arrived at unexpected time. It was never going to happen, and here's why. On the 5th of August, 1914, that's 1914, a British fishing ship manned by Marines and sailors, disguised as a fishing boat, they cut the transatlantic cable off the coast of the Netherlands. So from August 1914, the Germans couldn't use the submarine cable. They had to wire messages. By December 1914, the British had broken the German code. It took them 4 months. So the British were able to listen to all the messages going backwards and forwards from December 1914 to Washington, Berlin. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They knew before McDiarmada knew the name of the ship that was coming from Germany, the name of the submarine. They knew everything. So they had 2 destroyers sitting to wait as discovered by, so they would discover the stuff by accident because they didn't want the Germans to know they had broken the code. So when the U-boat came in on the wrong night and waited and waited and waited, and eventually decided to send Casement and a guy called Monteith and Bailey ashore on the Bannostrand, and then they disappeared back out to sea. And they were okay. That was U-19. I was saying to Sienna beforehand, there's a new book published yesterday by Rory Carroll of The Guardian. It's about Roger Casement. It's called Rebel and Traitor. And Rory, I've only read a couple of chapters. It was only published yesterday. He thinks that the U-19 was the submarine that sank the Lusitania in a couple of months earlier. It wasn't. Couldn't resist this. It was. It wasn't. It was the U-20. U-20 was a U-19 type U-boat. Anyway, so not everybody knows that. The other thing, U-19 was the first diesel submarine. So, here's another piece of irrelevant information. The first submarine, the proper working submarine, was devised by an IRB man called Holland, decades before this. There you go. And he was up to the same kind of thing for some reason. But it was not going to work. And because the British knew, they didn't know exactly when the rising was going to happen, but they were reading all the cables between Washington and Berlin, and New York and Berlin, everything that John Defoe and all the boys in America were saying. And the IRB in Ireland had to wait 6 days for the liners to arrive in Queenstown, as it was, so they could get the messages. But the British knew beforehand, and because they knew there was going to be a rising, they kept a whole division in Ireland, the 59th Division, which was due to go to the Somme. And luckily for them, there was going to be a rising, so they didn't get sent to the Somme, otherwise they would never have come back. The stuff about, this is the Germans got all mixed up and the IRB got it all mixed up, and not true. The British knew that there was a rising going to happen, and weapons are going to come from Germany and all the rest of it. And not only did the British know, it was the British Navy that broke the code. And people were saying to Captain Hall, well, you're going to have to tell Dublin Castle about, that there's going to be a rising. And he said, no, we aren't. Number one, because Dublin Castle leaks like a sieve. Number two, we want this to happen. We want there to be a rising that we are ready for. And we, as he said, we will be able to lance this festering wound and put an end to it. It didn't work out that way. One last point. McDiarmada nearly made it after he was captured, and the rest of them marched to Richmond Barracks. And they were lining people up to take him away to England to get interned. And he was there in the parade. And this guy, years afterwards, talked about it. Sean Murphy, Dublin IRB man, says, in the parade, in a rank behind me, Seán Mac Diarmada was standing, and I said to the volunteer behind me, please change places. Sean is an old friend of mine. I would like to walk down along with him because he can lean on my shoulder. I had taken his stick. So they changed places. While standing waiting for the march off, 2 G-men, John Barton and Hoey, were marching up by the side of the column, stepped forward, took MacDiarmada out of the ranks. Barton said to him, "Sorry, Seán, but you can't get away that easy. There will be 6 of you in the morning, I think." I should just to finish that particular thing. It's a Detective Daniel Hoey, described by Min Ryan's brother as young, handsome, intelligent, energetic, and popular with his colleagues who identified MacDiarmada. Michael Collins had him shot dead on the 12th of September 1919 outside Dublin Metropolitan Police Headquarters, what is now Pearse Street, while Sean Tracy shot John Barton dead in November 1919. But he nearly made it even then. After a number of executions, Asquith had been told General Maxwell, "That's got to stop." And there were only 2 left, James Connolly, Seán MacDiarmada, numbers 90 and 91. MacDiarmada was the last to get to Richmond Barracks, so he was the last number because he had a limp the whole way, and Connolly was being kept in Dublin Castle. And Maxwell wrote specially to Asquith and said, "These are 2 of the worst." And they were quickly executed the next day in case Asquith got over, got over to Ireland. He was coming to Ireland in case he got over and said, "No more shooting, no more executions." So he missed it by like 1 day. Okay.
Excellent.